author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
There's rumbling in the ranks of America's future vice president, whoever that may be. On today's special edition of Liberty Nation Radio, right here on the Radio America Network, we're going to be delving into the latest potential VP picks, what kind of legacy building they're going to do, the current state of the Supreme Court, and a whole lot more. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. You're listening to Liberty Nation Radio. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Let's get started. The stakes have never been higher for who presidential candidates choose for their number 2 on the ballot. To discuss the new entries into the race, the existing entries, we're joined by longtime host of this here radio show and Liberty Nation's senior political analyst, Mr. Tim Donner. Welcome back to the show, Tim.
Hello, Mark. Good to be here, as always.
Tim, you are my go-to fount of all knowledge on political analysis. And I suggest... I suggest everybody goes and reads your stuff over at LibertyNation.com. I wanted to get your take on a new contender, a new name that's being floated in the potential Trump VP stakes. I'm sure you know who I'm talking about.
Yes, well, it's somewhat close to home here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And I'm glad you started with that because I think there are many people around here in particular around the capital area of Virginia, Maryland, D.C., who realize that Glenn Youngkin, the governor of Virginia, is a rising star in the party. There's no question about it. He is someone who could probably check all the boxes for vice president. First of all, he's someone who could take the office on a moment's notice and not have a problem with the confidence of the American people. He has just the right sort of character to soften Trump in those areas that he needs the most help, which is independent suburban women or even moderate Democrat suburban women who are reluctant to vote for Trump. And I think he just gives you a sense of balance on the ticket. And to me, and I felt this for some time, but he was never mentioned until recently. It's always been my opinion that Glenn Youngkin would be the strongest single vice presidential choice for Donald Trump. And honestly, Mark, I don't think it's even close. And now, of course, there's all kinds of underlying factors. Nikki Haley would be a great choice, but we know that's not going to happen because of the personal relationship between the candidates and the fact that she's sort of from the different wing of the party. So there's a lot of reasons that alliances like these cannot be formed. But we know that Trump met recently with Glenn Youngkin in Virginia. And we also know, importantly, that Trump has pulled it into a tie in the last 2 polls in Virginia. And this is a state that Joe Biden won by 10 points, in 2020. So this is a dramatic swing. And taking Youngkin could very possibly put Virginia in play. And if Trump wins Virginia, he wins the election. No question.
Yeah, it's not just the 13 electoral college votes that the Old Dominion has.
Well, the other thing is that Virginia has a unique law. I think it's the only one in the country, as a matter of fact, where a governor is limited to 1 consecutive term. In other words, you can serve 2, but not back to back. So Youngkin's leaving office in January of 25 anyway. So it would coincide perfectly, and nobody could say he was abandoning his commitment to the people of Virginia.
We should check out his Craigslist account, see if he's put up a job thing saying looking for work, doesn't want to travel too far.
Right. That's the truth. Let's see, Richmond to Washington is about 2 hours.
It's pretty close. It's pretty close. Not for me in England. 2 hours, it's the other side of the country. But for Washingtonians and Virginians, yes. I'd actually like to come back on something you said about who else would be a good pick for Donald Trump. And you said Nikki Haley. Now, I can see why a lot of conservatives might want Nikki Haley, but I suspect that if Nikki Haley were his eventual choice, which she's not going to be, but that would put off a lot of his core base, right? Because Trump's
His
only
core base is not going to be put off by, I think, by whoever he picks as a VP, unless it's an out and out progressive. But this would be, look, it's not going to happen, but the reason it would be appealing is because suburban women love Nikki Haley. And because she's someone who could take over in a heartbeat. And in 1980, Ronald Reagan had a knockdown, drag-out fight with George Bush for the Republican presidential nomination. He edged him out, beat him decisively, but George Bush was a strong second. He brought a constituency that Reagan needed to strengthen, which was the Eastern establishment Republicans. And George H.W. Bush was an establishment Republican above all else. And that worked. They consolidated the sort of two wings of the Republican Party and went on to a 45-state landslide victory over Jimmy Carter. So that's the logic behind bringing someone like Nikki Haley. Of course, the problem is that Trump will believe, whether it's true or not, and it likely would be that Nikki Haley would start running for president in 2028 the moment that she was selected. And that brings us to someone else, Doug Burgum, who may be high on the list, mostly because he doesn't have overwhelming presidential ambitions. And Trump doesn't want to pick someone who's immediately setting up a presidential campaign for 4 years later.
I think one of the most fascinating names that has been floated for the shortlist is J.D. Vance. And I've read his book, and I believe he's a very clear thinker, but he's a little bit different from either the establishment conservative wing and the MAGA wing, as in he's very much a union backer, I believe, which is not something you really associate with either side of that.
Well, that's because he's in Ohio.
Yeah.
He has to be at least moderately pro-union. But look, J.D. Vance, picking him would be to double down on the MAGA agenda. It would be saying, we need more cowbell.
Yeah.
We need more MAGA because, Trump has a pretty good relationship with unions as it is. Okay, he has the MAGA vote locked up. He has Ohio locked up. I don't see what J.D. Vance would give you electorally. I don't know if he would inspire confidence as a future president because he's still a young politician. He's
only a couple of years in the Senate as well.
Right, and so I don't really get what he would bring other than to use a crude term, would be to be essentially a sycophant for Trump and just expand his message so that he can be sending that same MAGA message in two places at once.
Yeah, I absolutely see your point there. It would very much be a re-echoing of the MAGA platform, which I perhaps disagree with you on the eventual outcome on that. Not that I think he'll actually get the slot, although I suspect he might. But that Trump might be looking, rather than for shoring up different areas of weakness or prospective areas of weakness within his national campaign, he might be looking more for what will happen after he leaves office, because we saw in 2021 when Joe Biden took office, it took all of 3.5 minutes to a week to dismantle so much of what Trump had managed. So I think that there could be that element going into it.
That's why I think that Youngkin, again, coming back to Glenn Youngkin, he's He's a candidate that can unite the two wings. I've never heard a bad word about him, to be honest with you, Mark, from conservatives, MAGA people, whatever. He is a consensus rising star, right of center, whether you want to call him conservative, MAGA, neoconservative, whatever. We don't know what he thinks about foreign policy. But I can't imagine that anybody would look at Glenn Youngkin and say, geez, he really swung and missed on this pick.
You might well be right on that, Tim. Now, we're going to take a short break. After the break, we're going to come back and we're going to be talking about legacies, where they go, what they're for, and who needs them. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back with Liberty Nation's senior political analyst and longtime host of this here radio show, Tim Donner. Earlier in the show, we were talking potential new VP picks for Donald Trump. But now I want to expand this, Tim, to talk about both of the major parties, perhaps even the independents, and ask what kind of legacies are they hoping to build with their VP choices. Let's start with Joe Biden here. Now, it seems to me, despite a lot of internet chatter and even chatter on the pages of the left-leaning Fourth Estate about problems with Kamala Harris as the vice president, it seems to me that it's too late to change her. Nobody's really talking about seriously changing her out because it would just be a disaster optically. But what kind of a legacy are we looking at? Because there's a very good chance that if Joe Biden wins in November, before the next presidential election, Kamala Harris will...
It's not a very good chance. It's a virtual certainty, which is why I think, Mark, that as we get closer to the election, people are going to write, understandably, and they're going to remind voters, understandably, that a vote for Joe Biden is a vote for Kamala Harris. Because I don't think there's anybody in this country that thinks he can make it all the way to 86 in the condition he's in, which, again, we have to repeat, can only get worse, is virtually certain to get worse, and perhaps exponentially. But he is as frozen into Kamala Harris as his VP as he was in those appearances recently where he stood motionless on the White House lawn at that Juneteenth celebration. He's frozen into a wildly unpopular vice president. Now, last time, somebody could say, well, Kamala Harris was his insurance policy because while she fit all the racial and gender profiles and ideological profile, there wasn't a serious threat that Joe Biden couldn't make it through 4 years. It was a lot of speculation, but it wasn't a present reality. Kamala Harris as commander-in-chief, their legacy entirely pivots on what happens in this election. Joe Biden's been around 50 years in politics. His legacy will come down to this election. Donald Trump's been famous for decades. His legacy will come down to this election. For Joe Biden, if he loses this election, he will be a villain, higher than Hillary Clinton, probably even, for turning the presidency back over to Donald Trump. If he had quit after the midterms, Joe Biden would be a hero because he had taken down Trump once. They'd done well in the midterms, and then he could turn it over and say, I've done my job. Now it's time for the next generation of Gavin Newsom or Gretchen Whitmer or someone else. And for Donald Trump, you talk legacy. If he wins this election, he will have pulled off one of the most transformative political movements in American history. He will have changed the course of national politics for decades, generations, probably. If he loses, he will be someone that tore down the Republican Party by winning a fluke election once and then bringing the party low by losing the next two elections and turning the country over to the left. So he's got a huge pivot in his legacy as well as Biden, depending on this election outcome.
It's really a very real example of the weight of history weighing down on shoulders, and it does
Indeed.
make you wonder who has the strength to bear that kind of pressure. And it seems to me that Donald Trump, in some ways, he thrives on that kind of pressure. He does, and in fact, this is true for both of the candidates, Donald Trump and Joe Biden. They both see themselves as significant historical figures. Joe Biden, perhaps
Yeah.
because of his 5 decades in office, quite essentially rising from senator to vice president, and then coming back to oust the dreaded Donald Trump in his crowning victory, becoming president.
And that would have been his legacy,
yeah,
if he knew when to quit.
very true, very true. And then you've got Donald Trump, who conquered the business world, conquered the media world with his Apprentice show, among other things, and a cameo in Home Alone 2. Let's not leave that one out.
I remember it well. I remember it well.
And then he challenged for the Republican Party leadership as essentially what many people saw as a joke candidacy, with no other purpose than to boost his contracts for the next season of The Apprentice. And yet he went on to win, captivate an entire, well, let's not say an entire nation, let's say half the nation, and captivate half the nation with his ideas. And they're very popular ideas because they are populist in their essence. And he has the opportunity to either, as you say, be the person who won a fluke election and then brought the Republican Party low to more than a decade out of power, if that comes to be, or he changes the trajectory of one of the two leading parties in the entire country, and thereby change the trajectory of the Democrat Party as well, because if he wins, they'll have no choice but to return to the center. Does that make sense?
If Trump loses, the left will take it as an affirmation on all their left-wing policies, which they can now basically force those policies on the American people with impunity, because they don't even have to run that this guy Biden is going to run for re-election. And everybody knows Kamala Harris is never going to be president except by being elevated from VP when Biden inevitably steps down in a year or two or whatever. So they can really double down on this left-wing agenda with impunity. And likewise, Mark, just like Trump, they will leave an indelible mark. It'll be a transformative election one way or the other. Either we go full on progressive with no guardrails, or we turn back to what we had 4 years ago, and the left is forced to go back to the center, and we have a more normal political climate.
Heavy is the head that wears the crown, and the weight of history weighs a hell of a lot. Tim Donner, thanks ever so much for being with us.
Doesn't it, though? Thank you, Mark.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
As the November election fast approaches, one of the largest criticisms of Donald Trump was that he gave tax cuts to the rich. Now, did that help or hurt the debt and deficit? Well, that's a question that will be argued before the cameras, before the November election. To help us pass what this really means, we're joined by Liberty Nation's Economics Affairs Editor, Mr. Andrew Moran. Thanks for being here, Andrew.
Thank you for having me.
So, Andrew, it's all about tax cuts. The arguments that I'm seeing from the talking heads in the media are saying that Donald Trump gave tax cuts to the rich and will continue to do so. This is part of the new platform that's being leaked by associates of Donald Trump or sources familiar with Donald Trump, as I keep reading. Now, is that actually the case? And is it actually, if it is the case, is it actually wrong in terms of a net benefit to the United States?
So yes, former President Donald Trump, he did give tax cuts, and yes, it did benefit the federal government and the broader economy. This whole idea that it exacerbated debts and deficits, it's questionable because it also comes from conservative groups. You look at, for example, the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. They also released a great paper earlier this year talking about how, tax cuts, they fueled all this red ink that's across Washington, including the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. But that's incorrect. So first, as Liberty Nation has reported, you look at the federal revenue tax receipts, that has just gone up immensely over the last decade or two. Now, if you look at a report from the Congressional Budget Office, it's the nonpartisan budget watchdog. It warned before the passage of the legislation that revenues would fall by more than $1 trillion between 2018 and 2027. However, CBO updated its numbers and said that tax revenues would actually go up nearly $600 billion over that decade period. So this whole idea that tax cuts, are going to lead to less revenue, it's been debunked repeatedly.
Speaking of debunking, Andrew, there's this, if you search the Laffer curve, that being, correct me if I'm wrong here, the idea that the more you lower taxes, the more the tax receipts go up. If you look across the internet, there's all this talk about how the Laffer curve is a debunked theory. And then as I want to do, I delve down the rabbit hole to find out, well, who debunked it? Because we hear this language a lot, don't we, about it's been debunked. Well, who's it been debunked by? That's the big question. And it seems that the biggest debunker of all was former President George W. Bush, who called it something along the lines of voodoo economics. And so you've got all these left-leaning outlets claiming George W. Bush as the paragon of economic insight and theory. Now, I don't think that's right. What's the deal with the Laffer curve?
Okay, so there's a few things to unpack here. So first, under George W. Bush, tax cuts, yes, once again, it raised revenue. Problem with George W. Bush is that he put two wars on credit cards. He expanded Medicare Part D, which added trillions of dollars in new spending to the government coffers over the next 10, 20 years. That was his problem. But again, revenue still went up. Number two, left-leaning economists should like the Laffer curve because it's progressive. It's not regressive. You look at again, let's go back to the tax cuts. You look at IRS data, and if you look at the IRS data, it showed a few things. First, income tax collections climbed. Two, the share of income taxes paid by the wealthiest in society surged. The share of taxes paid by the bottom 50% declined. So these are things that left-leaning economists, individuals should like. The wealthy society are paying their fair share. Millionaires pay at least 40% of all income taxes in the United States. That's a positive according to left-leaning dogma. Now with the Laffer curve, the whole point of the Laffer curve is to find an optimal rate that balances raising revenue for the government and stimulating economic activity. Those Trump tax cuts prove that there's an optimal rate of whatever the figures was for those different demographics. What you should, however, complain about is how inflation arbitrarily lifts you into higher tax brackets, even though you're earning less because inflation eats your lunch. But I guess that's a different topic for another.
It's the unspoken sin, isn't it? That people don't realize that inflation, well, we may be earning more money to counteract this kind of, essentially it's a balancing act, isn't it? And so you've got your wages seem to be going up. Your spending power is actually going down, but because your wages are going up, you're entering into a higher tax bracket for many people. And Nigel Farage, the gentleman behind the Brexit movement in the United Kingdom, he made a very interesting point recently that all these middle income jobs are now in the 40p tax bracket in the UK. And before, many years ago, it was around 1 million people who were in the 40% tax bracket. But under the conservative Tory government of the last 15 years, now it's up to 8 million people who are in that bracket. And it's not as though they're actually any better off because, as you point out, inflation, reduced spending power. And of course, now they've got to pay an extra tax on top.
Yeah, if you look at Liberty Nation's X account, there was a great thread of all the reasons why the American people hate today's economy, and the main thing is that, yeah, nominally, which doesn't account for inflation, your wages have rocketed. However, once you account for the inflation, you see that your real income has been less. And then once again, if you compare the economies of former President Trump and President Joe Biden, there's a huge divergence between your real income gains, which was quite sizable for the average person under Trump, but have been negative or flat under the current president. So inflation, is for all these years you had economists saying how great inflation was, and now they got their wish, and you see how miserable everyone is. It was funny that leading into the whole inflation wave, everyone was saying, "Oh, you're going to love all this inflation. Why this is so great for the economy?" And everyone's dealing with it, and everyone hates it, and that could backfire on certain political folks.
So you've got Joe Biden and Donald Trump going head to head in the November election, presumably.
Yes.
Assuming they both make it there and they're not either incapacitated or in prison, or both. So you've got this battle of ideas coming up. Now, Joe Biden is going to continue saying that we need to raise taxes on those who can most afford to pay it, each according to their needs. Where have I read that? Oh, the Communist Manifesto. And then you've got Joe Biden saying, we're going to cut taxes and raise revenues. Now, it seems economically that Donald Trump has the right idea on this, because the Laffer curve, if you find the optimal point, which he found during his presidency, there's no reason to assume that he won't find it again. But how does the inflation rate affect that? Let's say, for example, Donald Trump wins, and then he tries to find that optimal point again between the tax rate and the tax draw. How is inflation going to impact that?
Well, once again, as we just finished discussing, depending on where inflation is, your tax brackets are going to go up. But under the Trump tax cuts, if they are extended, then of course your tax bracket will stay the same. The problem, however, is that where inflation is going to be. Now, you see this reacceleration in the overall inflation rate in certain pockets of the economy. Therefore, under Trump, you could see actually another increase in the inflation rate. Some economists I've spoken to say that the CPI could be around 4 to 5% by next year. That's quite a reasonable forecast if you look at some of the latest numbers. Not just if you're moving oil prices out of the equation, which has been a large factor in the reacceleration of inflation, services has been another massive thing. And then if you want to circle back to labor, that's also added to the CPI of higher labor costs, because the labor market is still tight despite its loosening up of certain conditions. But overall, inflation, it's still going to remain. No matter what Trump does, inflation is going to stay. It's going to stay above this 3-4%, despite what the Federal Reserve is saying, how it's going to restore to 2%. So Trump, what's funny is that he's going to get blamed when it increases again, but these are factors that are repeating the 1970s and 1980s. But I doubt it's going to reach that 15% market did in the early 1980s, just based on how the formula of how inflation is calculated has dramatically changed over the last 40 years.
So if Donald Trump wanted to walk away from a potential second term in office as somebody who did well with the economy, what he'd need to do is ensure through whatever mechanisms are available to the executive to encourage business enough that wages will outpace inflation and rein in spending. But it doesn't seem likely that anybody can really rein in the behemoth that is spending.
That is the absolute huge thing that's going to impact Trump, or should he win in November and serve 4 years. The spending will not go down. During his campaign, he has not addressed spending whatsoever. Even on Social Security, his whole idea is just, if you stimulate the economy enough, you're going to get all this higher payroll tax revenue. That's not that ship has sailed. The U.S. government, even though it's going to be impossible because of all the mandatory spending counts for about at least 2/3 of overall spending. Nothing is going to get done. The Republicans under Trump, they're not going to slash spending, so you're going to have this above trend inflation, and people are still going to hate the economy because inflation is eating all their income gains. Should Trump stimulate the economy through more tax cuts?
The stable economic ship has sailed. Andrew Moran, thanks ever so much.
Thank you for having me.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Is an ideological arms race for the Supreme Court on the horizon with the November 2024 election? Well, we're going to find that out today when we're speaking to Mr. Scott Cosenza, Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor. Welcome back to the show, Scott.
Cheers, Mark. Thank you. My pleasure.
So, Scott, everybody remembers when Donald Trump put out a list of names of potential Supreme Court justices. Now, I know that I was enthused by the fact that that would be there, and I know you were, and many
This is,
people.
of course, but just set the table for those who don't know. Before the 2016 presidential election, he put out a whole slate that a large group of judges that he said this is the pool from which he would select his justices from. It was remarkable. Yes,
it's remarkable because it's unprecedented. I think nobody's done it before. Now the question is, of course, as we're approaching the 2024 election, and this will be Donald Trump's third time around the block, does he still have a list in place? Is that list appealing to people who have a judicial bent? Does it appeal to them? And is it something that Joe Biden's going to emulate?
Well, I don't think Biden can emulate it because he's already made his case that he will only appoint justices who agree with him, basically. And so the specific identities of those judges aren't terribly important, I think, for, putting on my political analyst hat, sort of his voting block. He's made the reinstitution of abortion rights guaranteed by the federal government a cornerstone of his reelection campaign. I don't quite understand what he means when he says he's going to enshrine Roe v. Wade into law because, of course, Roe v. Wade is a court case that is no longer a valid precedent from the Supreme Court. So how do you enshrine that into federal law? That doesn't make any sense to me, but it's clear, I think, for him to communicating to his potential voters what he's about. The Trump thing, I think, was terribly interesting because there's so many different ways a person can be a quote-unquote sort of conservative judge, and the specific kind of views that they have about what the court's business should be is of vital interest to many thought leaders on the right. And I think it assuaged their concerns. You got to remember, Donald Trump was a really unknown as to how he would govern. And the Supreme Court decides all the most important issues of our time. Taxes, literally the very nature of what is life, when it can be extinguished or not. And every other thing. So it makes so much sense to me that any presidential candidate might say, hey, here's who I'm thinking of. But I don't think we're going to get names from Biden, in large part because all the people who might be on the Supreme Court for Biden will be working for the Biden campaign and double donating and everything else. So if their name's not on that list, it takes some of the gas away from, whose horse is in that race.
Yeah, that's a valid point there. So I think people are interested in what happens with the makeup of the Supreme Court precisely because presidents come and go, and the Supreme Court bench is a lifetime appointment, unless, of course, you're Stephen Breyer and you're politely asked to leave to make way for Ketanji Brown Jackson.
Well, I think Biden said in late May in Philadelphia at an event that he thought he would get 2 Supreme Court appointments, or the next president would get 2 Supreme Court appointments. So that's kind of fascinating. I don't know who exactly he thinks is going to go, but the older of the left bloc is Sonia Sotomayor, who's in her 60s, not terribly old for a Supreme Court justice. She's had some significant health challenges with public battles with diabetes and some other things. So maybe that's weighing on her, but I doubt, it's one of those roles that it doesn't require, 100-hour weeks for a whole year. They get months and months off at a time. They're wildly respected and revered, and she makes a mountain of money off of her book sales, which we've criticized in other forums. So,
well,
we'll see
Scott,
about that.
Maybe you've got the wrong end of the thread here. Maybe what Joe Biden meant was that the 2 justices that he might get to appoint would be to replace them on the conservative side.
Sure, Justice Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito are
the two biggest enemies to democracy,
Yeah.
according to the left.
The funny thing is, if those two are as motivated by politics as they're made out to be by the left, then it's almost certain they would wait another 4 years before retiring. We've had judges who basically phoned it in quite literally. I mean, they were in the courtroom for much of their experience, but also for the rest of the time when they weren't hearing cases, they literally performed their role as a Supreme Court justice from their island vacation residence. So we have a precedent for that. So it's not like,
well, as you know, working from home did become very popular during the pandemic.
I just mean that, if somebody was so motivated, it's an easy job to keep, I think. You don't actually have to write anything. You can just vote the way that you want to with results. Now, that's not what we hope that we're paying the justices for. We're paying for them literally the benefit of their jurisprudence, and it's good to see that on the page. But just in strictly, real politic terms, right? Keeping a seat occupied by a member of a certain philosophy, they can both do that pretty comfortably, I think, for a few years while they wait on.
I can just imagine Justice Clarence Thomas riding around all 50 states in his RV, as he's wont to do, dialing in a Zoom call to give his opinion-busting decision on things. And Justice Alito sitting under all the flags that his wife puts out and typing in his decision on the thing. By the way, on that message,
the Alito
I'm sure...
thing is hilarious. For people who don't know, he was criticized for multiple flags that his wife flew over their home. And it's funny, proud independent women are de rigueur on the left, except if somehow a conservative member of the Supreme Court has one. Then all of a sudden, they don't get independent opinions.
Let me take you a little further down the rabbit hole on this, Scott. I'm sure some of our listeners have heard this, but it's flown quite under the radar. So this was the Appeal to Heaven flag, which is essentially a pine tree on a white background. And some people
which is
on
a classic flag of the American Revolution, by the way. I own one. I've had one for many years. I
believe it was designed
flag
by a corporal who served under General George Washington.
Yeah.
Now, there was quite the uproar that this would be flying over the home of Justice Alito, because some people involved in the January 6th unrest were also carrying that flag. Let's forget the point.
Some tiny group of people adopted that flag for their cause de rigueur.
Let's bear in mind here, Scott,
Very
2 points there. 2 points there. Number one, there were also the American flag being carried in that crowd.
Yes.
So let's not get too far in the woods. But do you know where else has been flying that flag for 50 years and only took it down after these reports came out denouncing Samuel Alito?
I don't know.
San Francisco City Council. It's been in front of their building for half a century. Yeah, it's quite a twisting of narrative. Now, let's get one more big question on this, Scott, on the Supreme Court. There's been a lot of talk about changing the majority through, well, let's call it what it is, court packing, by appointing new justices. Now, there's a process in place to expand the court, isn't there? If one were inclined to do so.
Yeah, the process is just federal law would change. It's not, you don't need a constitutional amendment or anything big like that. If you have both houses of Congress and the presidency, like the Democrats had for a short time until the Republicans, or rather the Republicans captured the House, they could have done it. Biden made noises like he was going to maybe make a move to do it. And I presume that they got some pushback from some folks on their side that they said that maybe they wouldn't support it, or the cooler heads prevailed that, if you went to 11, then the Republicans, when they got power, they'd maybe go to 15 or something like that with their own. And of course, then, never ending cycle. So either way, it didn't happen. And I think that the Republic is the great beneficiary of it not happening.
Scott Cosenza, thanks ever so much for joining us.
Thanks, Mark.
And that's about all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio. I've been your host, Mark Angelides. I'd like to thank our guests for today, and of course, extend my thanks to you, the listeners, for taking the time to tune in each week and join us on the show. Thanks for being here. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.